It was a busy day in London, and the streets were alive with tourists eager to explore the city's famous landmarks. People from all over the world crowded around Buckingham Palace, snapping photos of the grand building, and the iconic royal guards standing tall in their traditional uniforms. These guards, known for their perfectly still stance and ceremonial duties, were an integral part of British history. It was a sight that tourists looked forward to seeing, and many of them couldn't resist the urge to take photos or even interact with the guards. However, most knew that these guards were highly trained and were not to be disturbed. Among the crowd was a woman, known for her entitled attitude, who seemed determined to cause a stir. Karen, as many people would later call her, was fed up with waiting in line for photos and was eager to make her presence known. She had already been causing a scene in various other places throughout the day, making complaints about everything from the weather to the length of time it took to get a picture. As she walked past the line of royal guards, she spotted one standing motionless with his tall bearskin hat perched on his head. The guard was doing exactly what he was trained to do, standing still, showing no emotion, and performing his duty to perfection. But for Karen, this posed an opportunity. She muttered something under her breath, and then, in a bold and somewhat reckless move, walked up to the guard. Without any warning, she reached up, grabbed the bearskin hat off his head, and yanked it down to the ground. The crowd around her gasped in disbelief as Karen, now holding the hat in her hands, began to stomp on it with a laugh. It was clear that she thought this was all in good fun, but the onlookers were stunned. A few tourists even tried to speak up, their voices filled with surprise and disapproval, but Karen brushed them off. She couldn't understand why anyone would be upset. After all, she was just doing what she wanted, and it seemed like no one would stop her. She stepped on the hat a few more times, a sense of satisfaction on her face as she reveled in the attention. Meanwhile, the royal guard remained completely still, refusing to react to the disturbance. His job was to maintain composure no matter what, and he wasn't about to break that rule, no matter how much Karen tried to provoke him. As Karen continued to make a spectacle of herself, some of the tourists began to take out their phones, recording the scene for their social media pages. They couldn't believe what they were seeing, an act of disrespect against a figure so deeply embedded in British tradition. But Karen didn't seem to care. She continued her antics, making remarks about the guard's uniform and laughing as though she was the star of the show. In the midst of the chaos, the atmosphere around the scene shifted. What started as a moment of amusement quickly turned into one of tension. The crowd's energy went from laughter to discomfort. The royal guard's stoic expression and calm demeanor only added to the surreal nature of the moment. It was as if time had slowed down, and Karen's actions seemed out of place in a setting where respect and tradition held so much weight. But to Karen, it was just another moment to make herself the center of attention, until something unexpected was about to happen. Karen would soon learn that disrespecting those who upheld tradition came with consequences. But for now, she had no idea that her impromptu stunt would soon cause her a lot more trouble than she could have ever imagined. The stage was set, and the drama was about to unfold. As Karen continued to stomp on the royal guard's bearskin hat, the scene around her began to shift. The few tourists who had been laughing at first now seemed less amused. Some of them exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing that Karen had crossed a line. They had come to see the royal guards, not to witness a disrespectful act. The guard, still motionless, showed no reaction, but it was clear from the growing tension in the crowd that something was about to change. A couple of tourists, noticing the change in the atmosphere, quietly began to step away from the scene. They had their phones out, capturing what was happening, but the fun of it had faded. A few others, still too shocked to speak up, watched the unfolding drama in silence. They could tell that the mood was turning from one of surprise to one of discomfort. Karen didn't seem to notice, though. She was too caught up in the moment, grinning and enjoying the attention she was getting. However, someone from the crowd had seen enough. A middle-aged man, who had been observing from a distance, finally stepped forward. He wasn't someone to ignore what he saw as disrespectful behavior, especially not when it was happening right in front of such an important symbol of British tradition. Without hesitating, he walked towards one of the nearby security officers who had been monitoring the area. He quickly explained what was going on, and the officer nodded, his face growing serious. The man could sense that the atmosphere had already started to feel like something more than just a prank. The officer then signaled to another guard, and they began to move toward Karen. It didn't take long for the response to be noticed by the crowd. The atmosphere shifted even further as the officers moved swiftly and confidently toward Karen, who was still caught up in her own little world. The tourists who had been recording the scene on their phones now seemed uncertain, unsure whether they should continue filming or put their devices away. Some of them whispered among themselves, wondering if Karen would get away with it. The anticipation was palpable. Everyone could tell that Karen's actions were about to have consequences, but no one knew exactly what would happen next. As Karen stomped on the hat once more, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around, startled, and was met by one of the security officers who had approached her from behind. His expression was calm, but there was a firmness to it that immediately made Karen pause. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his voice clear and authoritative. "You'll need to stop what you're doing and step away from the guard." Karen scoffed, surprised that anyone would try to stop her. "What? It's just a hat. Who cares?" she replied, brushing him off with a dismissive wave. She wasn't used to being told what to do, and she certainly didn't appreciate the officer's interference. But the officer remained unmoved. "This is a serious matter," he said. "You're disturbing a public figure and showing disrespect for the traditions here. You need to leave immediately." His tone was unwavering, and Karen could see that he wasn't going to let her continue her stunt. The tourists around her, once uncertain, now started to murmur amongst themselves, some nodding in agreement with the officer. The atmosphere was now charged with the energy of what was quickly turning into a very public confrontation. Karen stood there, shocked for a moment. She had never expected to be called out for her behavior, especially not in front of so many people. Her usual tactic of brushing off criticism wasn't working this time. The crowd, once entertained by her antics, was now watching her closely, waiting to see what would happen next. As the officer stood firm, Karen realized that this wasn't just a small prank anymore. It was a moment where her actions would be judged, and she couldn't simply laugh it off. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She had never been confronted like this before. Normally, when she caused a scene, people either ignored her or just let her get away with it. But this time, the officer was serious, and the crowd had shifted from amused bystanders to witnesses who were beginning to side with the security guard. Karen's usual confidence started to waver. She wasn't used to being in a position where she might actually face consequences for her actions. The officer's calm but firm voice broke her train of thought. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the area." His words were clear, without hesitation. He wasn't asking for her to stop. He was telling her that the situation was serious. And Karen, now realizing how many eyes were on her, felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She had always thought she could talk her way out of anything. But now, with everyone watching, the reality of her mistake was sinking in. At first, Karen tried to brush the situation aside, putting on an air of arrogance. "You can't tell me what to do," she snapped, her voice a little more shaky than she intended. "It's just a hat. No big deal." She turned back to the crowd, expecting at least a few people to laugh or back her up, but instead, she saw only disapproving looks. The group that had once been cheering her on with their phones out was now silent, their faces uncertain. Karen's boldness seemed to shrink with every second that passed. The officer didn't budge. He simply pointed to the guard who stood motionless beside them, still holding his posture despite everything. "You've disrupted the ceremonial guard," he said calmly, "and we can't allow that." Karen's eyes flicked over to the royal guard, and for the first time, she seemed to understand the gravity of what she had done. The guard was not just a man standing still in a uniform. He represented a tradition that had been in place for centuries, and she had disrespected that tradition, not realizing just how serious her actions were. As the officer waited for her to respond, Karen's mind began to whirl. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, some looking at her with judgment, others with curiosity. It wasn't just the officer who was asking her to leave anymore. It felt like the whole crowd had turned on her. She was no longer the center of attention in a good way. She was the woman who had disrespected a symbol of British history, and no one seemed to think that was funny anymore. "Please," the officer continued, his voice unchanging. "It's best if you leave before this becomes a bigger issue." He was trying to stay calm, but there was a clear sense of urgency in his words now. The situation was escalating, and Karen had no choice but to decide how to handle it. For a moment, she considered arguing further, trying to get out of the situation as she had done countless times before. But something in the officer's eyes made her pause. There was no room for negotiation here, no way to talk her way out of it. The reality of the moment hit her hard. The crowd was waiting for her to either accept responsibility or continue making a fool of herself. Finally, Karen sighed, the fight draining out of her. Her bravado had faded, and she reluctantly dropped the bearskin hat, which had fallen to the ground when she first started her stunt. She couldn't ignore the look she was getting from the tourists around her. They weren't looking at her with admiration anymore. Instead, there was a sense of disappointment on their faces. "Fine," she muttered, stepping back with her head down. "I'm leaving." The officer gave a small nod, signaling to another security guard to escort her away from the area. Karen, no longer the star of the show, walked away with her head hung low. Her initial confidence was gone, replaced by a feeling of humiliation she hadn't experienced before. The crowd watched her go, some shaking their heads, others talking amongst themselves, wondering what had just happened. But Karen was too embarrassed to notice. Her stunt had gone from a source of amusement to one of regret, and she knew that things wouldn't be the same for her after today. After Karen was escorted away, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace slowly began to return to normal, but the buzz from what had just happened lingered in the air. The tourists who had been watching were still talking about it, exchanging their opinions in hushed tones. Some felt bad for the royal guard, others were amazed at Karen's audacity, but most were simply shocked. It wasn't every day that someone openly disrespected one of the symbols of British tradition, and the event had left many people with a lot to think about. Karen, however, was far from being able to forget what had just transpired. As she walked away from the crowd, the weight of what she had done started to sink in. She was no longer the center of attention, and that was the worst part of it. For a brief moment, she had been the star of the show, but now she was simply a woman walking away from a public humiliation. Her mind raced as she replayed the events in her head. How had things gotten so out of hand? She had always thought she could push the limits, but this time it felt different. As soon as she was out of sight of the tourists, Karen tried to shake off the embarrassment. She didn't want to admit it, but it was hard to ignore the stares and the comments that followed her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, hoping for a distraction. But when she looked at her notifications, her stomach dropped. Social media was ablaze with videos and photos of the incident. Some of the captions were mocking, others critical, and a few were downright angry. People were calling her out for her behavior, some even questioning her understanding of respect and tradition. Karen had always prided herself on being able to get away with anything. But this time, things were different. The crowd had seen what she had done, and now they had made their judgment. The videos were being shared far and wide, and Karen knew that this was going to stick with her for a long time. Her social media feed was filling up with messages from people she knew, asking her why she had done it. She could already hear the disapproval in their voices, even through the text on the screen. Her mind raced as she tried to justify her actions. It was just a stupid hat, she muttered to herself. But deep down, she knew that it wasn't just about the hat. It was about disrespecting something bigger than herself, a tradition that millions of people around the world held dear. and no amount of defending herself on social media would change that. Karen had crossed a line, and the public's reaction was proof of it. In the following hours, things only got worse for Karen. The story spread beyond social media, picking up steam in the news. The headline, "Karen rips hat off royal guard," was plastered across websites and tabloids. Karen's face was now associated with the stunt she had pulled, and it wasn't exactly the kind of attention she wanted. People were calling her out for her behavior, with some even going so far as to say she should be fined or banned from certain areas. Her actions had not only disrespected a tradition, but had also left her vulnerable to public backlash. Even her friends, who had once found her boldness amusing, were starting to distance themselves. Karen tried to defend herself, posting angry comments and posts online, but they did nothing to calm the growing storm. If anything, they made things worse. The more she tried to explain herself, the more people pointed out how inappropriate her actions had been. Karen's reality was shifting. The social media storm, the articles, and the people now judging her had turned her world upside down. What had been a lighthearted moment for her had quickly turned into a regret she couldn't escape. She realized that no matter how many times she hit send on a post or tried to explain herself, the damage had already been done. The more she tried to make excuses, the more the story seemed to spiral out of control. And the worst part was, there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her attempt at getting attention had backfired, and now it felt like the whole world was watching her, judging her every move. As the days passed, Karen could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. What had started as a careless stunt had grown into something far bigger than she had ever expected. Her name was now everywhere, not for anything positive, but for the disrespect she had shown to a cherished British tradition. She had tried to move on, thinking that the storm would eventually blow over, but the reality was far different. The backlash was relentless. The more Karen tried to distance herself from the incident, the more it followed her. Every time she opened her phone, there were new messages and posts calling her out. News outlets continued to cover the story, and her face was plastered on social media as the Karen who disrespected a royal guard. The comments kept pouring in, from both people she knew and complete strangers. Some were simply curious about what had gone through her mind, while others were filled with anger, questioning her sense of entitlement. The worst part for Karen was the way her friends had reacted. Many of them had unfollowed her on social media or commented with disappointment. Some tried to be more direct, sending her private messages telling her that they were ashamed of her behavior. It stung, especially since she had always considered herself the one who could keep things lighthearted and fun. But now, she realized, her usual approach wasn't working. She wasn't just a source of amusement anymore. She was a symbol of disrespect, and that was something that didn't go away quickly. For the first time, Karen began to understand just how much her actions had affected others. The royal guard, who had quietly and calmly done his job without breaking his composure, had become a symbol of dignity and tradition. And Karen, in her attempt to make a joke, had disrupted that. The tourists who had witnessed the scene were left with an impression of a woman who thought she could get away with anything. And the world was now watching her closely. The attention wasn't all negative, though. Some people took a more measured approach, offering a chance for Karen to reflect and learn from her mistake. They encouraged her to apologize, suggesting that perhaps a public acknowledgement of what she had done wrong could help her regain some respect. Karen wasn't sure at first. She had never been one to apologize easily, especially not in situations where she didn't feel she was entirely at fault. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that those suggestions might be right. She decided to take the advice seriously. Karen posted an apology online, one that was carefully worded and sincere. She acknowledged the mistake she had made and expressed her regret for disrespecting the royal guard. The post wasn't easy for her, and she felt exposed as she clicked publish. But it was a start. She knew that the road to repairing her reputation wouldn't be easy, but it was the right thing to do. To her surprise, many of the comments under her post were supportive. Some people praised her for owning up to her actions, while others admitted that they had judged her too harshly before hearing her side. It didn't change everything, but it felt like the beginning of healing, at least for her. She realized that respect wasn't something that could be demanded or taken for granted. It had to be earned. And in her case, that meant facing the consequences of her actions and making amends where possible. Karen's life slowly started to return to some semblance of normal, but the incident would never fully fade away. It had taught her a lesson she would carry with her from now on, that a moment of thoughtless fun could lead to lasting consequences, and that respect for others was more important than being the center of attention. The apology was just one step, but it was enough to remind her of the power of humility and the importance of learning from her mistakes. While the storm of negative attention eventually calmed down, Karen knew that she would never forget the lesson she had learned the hard way. It was a moment that had reshaped her understanding of respect, and she would carry that lesson forward into every interaction, hoping to do better next time. The incident had changed her, and perhaps, in a way, that was the silver lining she needed.